When I'm not here, they canceled meetings. Yeah, they managed to hold one on the one
Okay.
the month I'm not here, and cancel the other two. Yeah. It's pretty annoying.
All right. All right.
Somebody wants
Members of the Planning Commission, if you come to order, and I'll call to order the Thursday, September 20th, 2012 meeting of the Planning Commission. Madam Clerk, if you would call the roll, please.
Yes. Commissioner Thompson? Absent. Commissioner Schwartz?
Here.
Commissioner Larson?
Here.
Commissioner Campanella?
Here.
Commissioner Bartlett?
Here.
Commissioner Jordan?
Here.
Chair Lodge?
Here. All right, that brings us to item 2, preliminary matters. The first one, A, is action on the review of the following minutes and resolutions, the draft minutes of September 6th, 2012. Any corrections, additions, deletions? Commissioner Bartlett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 2 of the minutes, down toward the bottom of the page, there's the sentence talking about Fred Sweeney. That has been duplicated also on the third page, and the one on the third page is actually correct because the order in which he spoke was after public comment, and the way it's worded there is more correct because he is from the Single Family Design Board, not the ABR. So if you keep the second one, there's one reference to ABR that should be SFDB, and on page 2, just delete it entirely. And on page 5, sentence number 4 at the very top, at the end of that line, it should say, consider an option of transferring only square footage and not the traffic, not that that's the only choice. So just say, consider an option, number 4 at the very top of page 5.
Page 5.
At the end of that sentence, consider an option, scratch the word possibility, option of transferring. And that's it for my comments.
Thank you for catching those, Commissioner Bartlett. Anything else? Commissioner
Thank you,
Campanella?
Madam Chair. On the same page on number 6, it was a comment that I had made at the meeting about the development of residential housing and the economic development of commercial use have to go hand in hand, which is true. I just wanted to make it clear that I was really talking about allowed commercial use, not expanding commercial use, if there was any confusion about that. Thank you.
So you would like to add the word allowed,
Allowed if possible.
in front of
So
commercial?
I'd be clear.
Anything else? All right, if not, the motion would be in order to approve the minutes as corrected, amended.
So moved. Second.
Motion made and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Madam Chair, I'll be
Sorry.
abstaining. I wasn't present.
Okay. With one abstention, Commissioner Jordan. That brings us to 2B, which is requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items. Are there any
None
such
of those things.
And any announcements or appeals?
I would like to announce that 2 days ago on Tuesday, the council adopted the climate action plan. And you may recall from maybe August when the Planning Commission reviewed that document. And it wasn't, I'm not sure it was changed at all between when Planning Commission saw it and when Council saw it. And Council approved it without any changes. That's my announcement. Thanks.
Okay. All right, then that brings us to the time for comments from members of the public pertaining to items not on today's agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to speak to the Planning Commission on any such thing? Not seeing anyone come forward, I would close that part of the hearing. And we will go on to, item 3, discussion item, airport master plan status update. And will be making that.
Thank you,
Mr.
Madam Chair, Planning Commissioners. I'm Andrew Bermond from here to talk today about the airport master plan and our process so far. Just sort of as maybe a refresher for most of us, the airport master plan serves two roles. It's both a demand-based document to help identify funding priorities for federal grants and safety projects, as well as an aspirational document for what the future of the airport is in our community. And that's primarily divided between those projects that would be funded through FAA airport improvement grants or things that would be either done by the airport department or public works or private development. Just as background, the current plan for the Santa Barbara Airport is the Aviation Facilities Plan, which was adopted in 2001. That planned for a planning period that extended through 2015 and included major projects which the airport has completed in the past decade or so. Those being the runway relocation and creek relocation project, the expansion of the airline terminal, which will be finished in a couple weeks, and the wetland restorations in the Gleas Loop. The airport last year engaged in an RFQ process to select a consultant. Then it spent most of the summer finalizing the scope of work and securing funding from the FAA. This plan is funded predominantly through an FAA planning grant. And then just last November, we selected Kaufman Associates to prepare the plan and participate in the planning process. And so today I have here with me Jim Harris from Kaufman Associates, who's the principal planning firm on the team, as well as Chris Eberhardt from CommuniQuest, who is doing the planning or public outreach for the plan. So I'll turn it over to Jim now to talk about how we've done with the plan so far.
Okay. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Andrew. Madam Chair, members of the commission. Should give you an idea of where we're at and really where we're going in the particular process. Andrew did a good job of outlining really the requirements of the plan or why we're doing the particular plan, but I wanted to point out a couple things that are important. The plan itself, as was recommended, is updated on a regular basis. FAA and certainly the airport and the city would like to have the most current up-to-date plan possible, but it is very important that the plan is up-to-date and that the desires of the airport, the FAA, the community are all well reflected in the particular plan. Now, while the master plan is developed and it actually becomes the city's plan for the airport, oftentimes people think, well, you send it to the FAA and they approve it. Well, they do to some degree, but they only approve two specific elements of the plan, one of which is the forecast, which again we'll talk about in a moment, but we do look out 20 years looking at the forecast demand for aviation activities at the airport, and FAA is very interested in those forecasts and how the community does their planning based on that. The other piece that FAA will ultimately approve is the airport layout plan. It's that oftentimes you might see a large drawing of the airport that reflects all of the technical documentation that FAA requires, as well as the future projects and elements of airport development are reflected on that plan. So it's an important document. At the end of the day, it is approved by the city ultimately and forwarded to the FAA for their approval as well. The plan itself serves as the justification, the backup documentation for all of these elements that we're talking about. A couple things about the plan. I believe you have a handout as well that kind of gave you an idea of where we're at. But just in short form, we're basically about halfway through the plan. We're up through facility requirements, and what you see here are basic elements of the plan, and the structure of the planning document itself is set forth by the FAA. They have very specific items they want you to cover during a plan and specific things that need to be addressed during the planning effort. So we do follow that format, and as do other airports. And so at this point in time, we've covered a variety of topics which have led us up to the stage we're at now, which is we're in the process of just starting to delve into the alternatives evaluation. But those elements that we've done so far have been an inventory effort, a detailed background research of the airport and all the data about the airport, all the improvements have been made, really get a good base from which to work. We have developed the forecast, as I said. We'll talk about that in just a moment. We've evaluated what we refer to as demand capacity. We look at the capacity of the airport in its various functions, whether it be the airfield or parking or terminal space. We've evaluated that, and we've identified facility requirements. We've identified whether there are some short-term deficiencies for certain facilities or whether they're long-term to meet the aviation demand. So we've been through that process, so it's really given us the framework for which to study the alternatives that we're moving into at this point in time. A couple real key elements, I think, of this particular planning effort where there's quite a bit of emphasis. First and foremost is environmental. There's been extensive environmental inventory work done on the airport so that we have a good basis for all the environmental resources. So as we study the alternatives or look at development of the airport, we're very keenly aware of the environmental issues and resources that have to be taken into consideration as you evaluate and look at different development items on the airport. So that's very important. The other one is a very robust public outreach effort, and Chris will be talking about that after I finish my presentation. So very, very key elements to the process. Again, we're somewhat about halfway through the process, as I mentioned. Just taking you forward a little bit, we will be moving through other elements, as I said, the alternatives. It will also go through the development of a final concept plan for the airport, which will basically lay out in conceptual form where we think the improvements will need to take place over the next 20 years. Along with that, a capital plan will be developed, a financial plan which will evaluate all the costs that are involved in development, as well as funding sources and really what is the city's responsibility in terms of costs, et cetera, for the capital plan. Will be quite a bit of environmental review both in NEPA on the federal side and in CEQA to go through the environmental analysis relative to the recommended program. And as I mentioned, once the city has actually approved the document, the airport layout plan documents or plans will be submitted to the FAA for approval. So we've got quite a bit of work ahead of us, but just to kind of give you a little jump start on where we'll be going in the process, and I'm sure we'll be briefing you in the future as to where we're at as we move through this process. One of the things that I think came about through the initial discussions when we started the plan was the establishment of guiding principles for the plan. This is very consistent with guiding principles that the airport already has, so it made a great deal of sense to make sure that those were consistent with the plan, and just quite quickly through that. Obviously, safety and security, number one principle for the airport. Economic vitality, transportation diversity, community, sustainability, environmental preservation, and cultural resource protection. All of these become kind of the hallmarks of everything that we're looking at and frame how we evaluate the recommendations of the plan itself. A little brief on the airport. The airport, as you know, are quite familiar where it's located, sits on approximately 948 acres of property, which, of course, is highlighted in this particular area. If we go ahead, Andrew, to the next one, there's an little hard to read, I'm sure, but what we've done is we've placed the indications of the runway dimensions on there. The primary runway is known as runway 725, and you're all familiar with the improvements that were made to the safety area at the airport and in the past. But that runway is just a little over 6,000 feet in length and is the primary runway that actually has most of the instrument capabilities on that runway. There are two parallel crosswind runways, both about 4,100 feet in length, that are exactly for that purpose, crosswind conditions and operating. Primarily, they can only serve the smaller aircraft because of the size of those runways. But along with that, there are all the taxiways for the movement of aircraft, and you can see they have their own nomenclature and designations, for example, Taxiway Alpha and Taxiway Hotel. They're all ground movement of aircraft on the airport, very important, and we look at an awful lot of that during the planning effort as we look for the efficiency of the airfield, ensuring safety of the airfield. So that's a big part of the planning process. And then the instrumentation, which is really important, particularly for an airport like Santa Barbara, with the weather conditions as they can be. It's good to have very strong capabilities with instrument approaches. You do have, and I know this is a little cumbersome to read, but this has to do with talking about the different types of instrument approaches that the airport has, which is actually quite a few, which is quite good. But they're all primarily related to runway 725. And they do allow you to operate in very low minimum conditions when your cloud ceilings are low or fog conditions, and will allow the best utilization of the airport having those instrument approaches, which is quite important for not only the commercial traffic that takes place for passenger traffic to ensure that passengers can get in and out, but also the corporate and other traffic that operates here as well. I mentioned earlier the forecast. The one thing I wanted to say about the master plan, and I think we can't ever state it quite enough, is it is, and Andrew said it at the beginning, it's a demand-based document. And what we mean by that is while we do all this forecasting and we're looking out 20 years, the plan itself is driven by the activity levels of the airport. So in other words, when the demand occurs is when you should be looking at improvements, not because it's a particular year or point in time, but when you have when you've reached an indicator or something that would say there's justification for development projects, that's when you look at that. And so I know each year the airport looks at that, FAA looks at that for funding as well. And so the forecasts that we do are demand-based, and we start to put them in terms of short, intermediate, and long-term, and it's a 20-year plan. The short term is essentially 5 years, intermediate 10, and long-term 20. Today, well, let me back up just a moment. The activity indicators that I mentioned, we generally look at things such as annual enplanements, and enplanement is a passenger boarding on a commercial plane. So you look at enplanements, you essentially double that, and you can tell how many passengers move through your airport in a given year. Cargo has its own measurements. General aviation-based aircraft is an important component. All the privately owned and corporate-owned aircraft on the airport are another indicators for facility needs. And then finally, operations or takeoff and landings. Those, again, are activity levels that dictate how the airfield operates and, again, what type of operations we have, whether they be the air carrier, cargo, or military or general aviation. All of those are broken down into different numbers so that we have a good handle on what the activity levels are for each segment of aviation on the airport. To make a long story a little bit shorter, we evaluated a number of different forecast scenarios. We're required by FAA to go through several different methodologies, and we certainly aren't going to take you through all of those, but those methodologies lead us to a recommendation of a particular set of forecasts which are then submitted to the FAA. The FAA is most concerned that those forecasts are reasonable, that they're not an over-prediction, that you're not being too pessimistic. They want to make sure that the forecasts are reasonable. So these forecasts, and these are the ones that evolved out of the planning process to date, have been submitted to the FAA and received their preliminary, I don't want to say final approval yet, but they have reviewed them. They feel comfortable with the numbers. They've asked for a couple changes that don't result in any changes to the final numbers, but those have been through that process and are being finalized as we speak. To tell you where we're at again, at the end of 2011, we're about 365,000 passenger enplanements. We do anticipate that number growing to 657,000 by the 20-year term. So not quite a doubling of passenger activity. These numbers are tied to a lot of local community indicators in terms of population growth, socioeconomic factors, demographics. So they're all locally based, but then again, they're also reflective of what's happening in the aviation industry as a whole. Cargo is not a real significant element here. You have cargo, and it will grow. It will, grow by about, again, 50-some% over that period of time. Based aircraft, 178 aircraft at the airport today, growing to approximately 236. General aviation as a whole it really has difficult times during economic recessions. That's not unusual. The one segment that has seen recovery more quickly has been the corporate activity at the airport. The private jets, the corporate jets, the business jets that utilize the airport have actually recovered more quickly than general aviation as a whole, although they're part of that segment. The operation numbers, the takeoff and landings, were just slightly over 100,000, 108,000 in 2011. Those will grow to approximately 133,000 over time. So again, you'll see about a 33% increase in those numbers. And they all differ slightly. The air carrier, you don't see huge growth in operations, but what you will see over time is change in fleet, larger aircraft as they transition, say, from the 50-passenger jet to the 70 and 90-passenger jet. So they'll be carrying more passengers with a particular aircraft. So those numbers are again, our base planning numbers. And again, as a plan is implemented, you'll look at those numbers every year to see where you're tracking along those lines as to whether you implement different programs. I mentioned demand capacity before. Probably one of the more significant areas that we look at is the airfield. Does the airfield have the capacity to accommodate the operational levels we talked about? We measure capacity on an airfield by what's known as the annual service volume, and that's the ability to accommodate takeoff and landings. Your airfield configuration is quite good. Given the operational levels you have, you can look at it and say, even by the long term, you're only reaching 65% of your capacity. So the airfield perspective, very good shape. We're not looking at any changes, quite frankly, to the airfield. From a runway standpoint, we'll be looking at taxiways and some other things, but the runway system is in quite good shape and plenty of capacity. We've also looked at other elements of the airfield in terms of capacity. For example, you have a beautiful new terminal which is operating at about 65% of the capacity levels now. So again, it was built with growth in mind, so you have the ability to grow into the terminal over time. Okay. Another element that's real important for the airfield is the design characteristics of the airfield. Dependent upon the size of aircraft that operate at the airport, which I can tell you that on a regular basis, all of these aircraft, these groupings, which we refer to these coding system, the alphanumeric system, is an airport reference code. And it's the letter designation as it gets larger, A, B, C, and D, refers to the approach speeds of the aircraft. So the higher performance aircraft have a higher approach speed. The Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3 and above refer to the wingspan of the aircraft. So the design of the airfield is based upon that airport reference code, which is driven by the characteristics of the aircraft. You have most all of these aircraft up through this area, up through the C3 and D3. That happens to be a 737-700 aircraft. You have all of those operating at the airport from time to time. You generally don't have the larger aircraft, so hence they're kind of grayed out to indicate they're really not a factor in the design of the airfield. It's more the other aircraft. The critical aircraft design is when the FAA says you got to be having about 500 operations of those particular aircraft per year, and then you start to design your facilities around those. So the aircraft that really dominate the airport right now are the D3 and the C3 aircraft, which are these over here and everything below. So from more the private sector standpoint, you're looking at the Gulfstream 500s, the G5s, the Gulfstream 650s, the bigger, higher performance corporate aircraft drive the general aviation mix. More the regional jets, whether they be the Embraer 170 and 90 or the CRJ 900, but even the 737, are the aircraft which predominantly drive the design standards for the passenger aircraft. So those are, again, some parameters we use for the airfield design. Now, after we've gone through the evaluations and to the point we're at in the study, before we get into the alternatives evaluation, we really have to identify what are the considerations. Now, we've gone through all the number crunching. What do we really need to focus on? Well, from an airfield perspective, there are several of them. I mentioned we're not looking at runway length or issues like that. The runway lengths are satisfactory. And the airport has spent a lot of time and effort making sure the runway safety areas, a lot of design standards are in place. The mitigation of the taxiway hotspots, what that is, there's 4 of them on the airport that have been identified by the FAA. There's high activity areas. There's areas where in some cases there can be a little confusion where taxiways cross certain areas or cross runways, but they are potential areas where you can have what's called a runway incursion, where an aircraft maybe enters a runway safety area that it shouldn't. So it's really something that air traffic control looks at, and we try to look at ways to avoid those. What can we do with new taxiway configuration or marking and lighting that would avoid those situations? So there's 4 of those that we're going to be evaluating. Taxiway hotel, that's on the north side of the airport, there's a taxiway that runs. It's partial parallel on the north side of 725, but it doesn't go all the way to the west to the end of runway 7. We're going to look at taking hotel all the way to the end of runway 7. A couple reasons why. Number one, operationally, it avoids aircraft crossing the runways to go to the other side and up the taxiway on the south side. But also, as more growth occurs on the north side, particularly with growth of general aviation on the north side, we'll have more aircraft on that side of the field. So we want to make sure they use a parallel taxiway on the north side as opposed to crossing to the south. Other taxiway exit locations, these are just other locations all over the airfield, as I mentioned, that we need to look at and make sure they're as efficient as possible, that they ensure that there's no confusion, it moves aircraft efficiently on the ground. A visual approach aid for runway 15 right, 33 left. That's the crosswind runway that we talked about, or one of those. Looking at some visual aids that will help. Some of the other runways already have these, but looking at that for visual guidance to the pilots, just to give them a good descent approach angle to the runway. And then finally, there's about an area off the north end of the crosswinds that's referred to as runway protection zones. The FAA generally likes to have you, as the airport operator and owner, have some control over those protection zones so that you don't have incompatible development or safety concerns. So there's about 8.7 acres, which we'll need to look at. Are there ways for you to control either through navigation easements or some land use controls? So we'll be looking at that. But those are the primary airfield considerations that we're looking at. From the terminal standpoint, again, we very rarely start a master plan with a brand new terminal, so that made it much simpler in the sense that when we look at expansion, as I mentioned, you're pretty well in good shape, have expansion capabilities. When we talk about these considerations, adding the 9,700 square feet, that's really more a long-term consideration as you continue to grow and start to bump up against some capacity numbers, whether it be 15, 20 years out. And oftentimes it's elements of the terminal, because there's functional areas within the terminal, whether it's ticketing, whether it's bag claim, whether it's car rental, passenger waiting areas, things of that nature. So there are some areas, but it really doesn't equate to too much space needs. What we're saying basically is the terminal is really good through the long term. It will just need fine-tuning over time like most do. The apron area and the overflow parking, the gate apron, there are now, we're going to, of course there are jetways there, and there are some gates that operate without them. But over time, there'll be 3 more passenger loading bridges, equipped gates, that will be required as activity increases. And then one of the deficiencies we've noted is overflow or diversion apron whenever you have aircraft that stay overnight, or passenger aircraft, or aircraft that are diverted from another airport that might come to Santa Barbara. They need space to park so they're not in the way of all the other activities. So we do need some more space for the overflow parking. We'll be looking at that, or aircraft parking. Parking, that is an area that I don't think anybody's surprised by the fact that there are going to be needs for more parking. We're going to have to spend a lot of time looking at that. In particular, closure of long-term Lot 2 on the north side of Hollister. A lot of flooding considerations, a lot of operational cost considerations, trying to get that closer to the terminal and be more efficient for the passengers and the community. So we'll be looking at that. And just a couple more housekeeping areas. The lavatory dump station for the aircraft is remotely located. It's very inconvenient and clear on the north side of the field. And a trash compactor for handling aircraft waste will have to be located a little more in proximity to the terminal. General aviation, along with the terminal being developed where it is, we do need more area on that side. So we're looking at consolidating all the general aviation facilities to the north side of the field, north of runway 725. That also provides an element of safety in separating the passenger activity and general aviation, and will allow for the north side to redevelop in a more functional manner for the general aviation community, including more aircraft storage. There is definitely a clear need for more aircraft hangars and storage of aircraft, particularly over time. Parking, deficiencies in parking for general aviation activity, some of which is just the parking's there, but it's in the wrong location. It needs to be moved, consolidated, things of that nature. Fuel storage will need to be increased over time, particularly Jet A fuel, more turbine aircraft, more corporate aircraft operating. Helicopter parking, we're talking about parking positions. In other words, where a helicopter lands and just parks, there's really an inadequate number of parking positions around the airfield. So we'll need to look at adding a few more there. And full perimeter security fencing around the airport, ensuring that it meets all the security requirements of Homeland Security and TSA. And a new maintenance yard for aircraft or airport maintenance. The current airport maintenance yard is in an area which is subject to flooding. So we'll see if we can find a location that over time could be better suited and be in an area that won't be subjected to those particular conditions. So those are the elements that we've identified that we're really keeping focused as we go into the alternatives. And with that, I mentioned the public outreach, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who'll give you an overview of what's taken place in that area.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Ms. Eberhard.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners. Last but definitely not least, want to spend a moment on how we have woven the public outreach portion of this project throughout the process, as Jim had mentioned, starting with the element of a Master Plan Advisory Committee, or PAC, which we have scheduled 5 meetings throughout the project process. And this committee is comprised of both individuals and organizations as well as public agencies. I think there's about 23 all told, and we've had 3 meetings thus far. Starting last December was the first one, and then the next 2 were actually on the same day as the public workshop. So one was in March and one was in July. And we've had very good attendance and participation at that committee. It is intended to get input through draft material that then the technical consultants can use, and it's been a good give and take, I think, thus far, and we'll have another meeting is scheduled in conjunction with the public workshop scheduled for November 28th. And that is the second element of our outreach program, the public workshops, of which we have 4. And we've had, as I mentioned, 2 so far. One March 28th and one was July 11th, with the third one scheduled for November 28th. We've got, I think, a good attendance at each one. The first one in March, the comments were pretty much just in general what is the master plan process, and also more interest probably in the terminal than anything. At the last workshop in July, most of the interest was from general aviation pilots and their desire and need for more general aviation hangars. Another aspect, and I believe you have copies, and we've distributed both to the PAC and at public meetings, and I know staff has distributed to the public in general, but an initiation brochure, because a master plan, as Jim described, a master plan is somewhat different from what maybe many people think of as a master plan. So this really describes what it is, what the process is, and how especially a member from the public can participate. Another aspect, an important one today for all of us, is the project website, and that is linked through the airportsflysba.com website. And the project website allows for draft material developed by the consultants to be available for viewing and download, as well as public notices. For example, our workshops are always noticed on the website, and it's been very effective. Also, newspaper ads. Before each of the public meetings, we have placed display ad in the media, and also have sent out press releases, and it's been well received. It's also been Twitter and Facebook, which social media today is another avenue for letting interested parties know about meetings. I think there has been good, the airport tends to get very good coverage from the media, and I would say I'm very pleased with the workshops. The press releases have been placed, and of course the ads were, but also television station is covered, I believe, both of the workshops, and with very good coverage, so that's nice and expands the awareness. Lastly, of the overall elements, there will be, this is the initiation one, of course, but there will be a summary brochure developed toward the end of the process, and that will describe and be available for anyone as time goes on who might want to know what happened during the master planning process and what the outcome was. So that will be developed toward the end of the process. With that, I'll turn it back to Jim. I think we're open for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Everhart. Any commissioners? Questions? Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Schwartz and I were both lucky enough to be designated the Planning Commission participants in this process, and I just want to congratulate airport staff and Kaufman Associates for putting up with us, or putting up with me. I meet that poster child point of what is a master plan, and let me tell you what it is, because I know you have a different idea right from the start. If you can imagine, a group of people that know what it is, and then another group of people who are a little more entrepreneurial and just want to say, what about this? What about that? Let's try that, and having to be reined back by a process that's really a template FAA requirement and process. It was very educational. And just a couple, so far, a couple observations that I've come away with that I think are really good. And that was that it is a structured process, and I now know a little bit more about what it entails and what it can't entail. It's not an opportunity to ask about why I can't fly to Seattle instead of going to Denver first, or why I can't have a different restaurant in the airport. And that it was really an introduction and education for me to the diverse number of stakeholders and sort of business functions that occur out at the airport, particularly the general aviation community and the logistics that support that, and how important that is. And it's really easy when you go down after dinner at the harbor to know that we have a fishing fleet. But when you go fly the airport, you're kind of in the lobby, and then you're looking at the mountains when you go through the new gates, and then you're on the airplane, and you don't really realize there was, 200 individual airplanes parked out there at all time paying rent, hangar and logistical facility companies out there servicing them, and then another group of transient private aviation that comes in and out of that airport, and just what an integral part that is. And then another thing I was struck at going through this process, too, is just how important a process is and how well it works into being ready in the case of any type of natural disaster that shuts us off geographically going north and south, and how it really, you just assume that the airport will be the fallback if that happens, and this really starts to look at some of those situations now and moving 20 years down the road and begins to address them and thankfully in a structured way that keeps me unfocused from what kind of restaurant, but how I'll answer a natural disaster and be ready for that. So again, congratulations to the airport staff and also to Kaufman Associates so far.
Okay. Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could we put back up the slide that identifies the principles we've established we're using? One thing that I've appreciated, both from Kaufman Associates and the planning group in general, is that right from the start, there was receptivity to linking or aligning the principles of this planning process with the principles of the City of Santa Barbara's general plan, and I mentioned that early on in our meetings. And you ran with that right away and adopted those, and I think that's an important alignment. Not only because the airport is on city property, but also as we look at regional planning, and we've been discussing regional planning even more lately with our climate action plan and so forth. I think this is a key element, so I want to thank you very much for that. And then my only question today, and I've been pondering this a lot in the course of our meetings, is this issue of planning capacity. And in the matrix that you've provided, we have a long-term view for 657,000 enplanements. I think that's 65.3% of the capacity. And something that I'm asked just by airport goers is whether or not we're planning for increased carrier competition. In this planning process, are we going to provide the average user of that airport more opportunities to fly to greater places at, in many cases, more reasonable price points, which I know we don't control, but I think there's a key interest in that for those who fly in and out of Santa Barbara frequently, so I appreciate, I don't know if it's our airport director who wants to comment on that or you, Mr. Harris, but I appreciate your thoughts to that.
Well, you bring
Mr.
up a
Harris.
good point, Madam Chair, Commissioner Schwartz. The whole plan is dedicated towards serving the aviation demands of the community. So a well-positioned plan allows those activities to occur and for the community to take advantage of the opportunities as they come along. I can guarantee you that the airport staff on a daily basis is looking at air service. You know, again, their job is really to promote the air service to the community and serve the community. So along those lines, I'll certainly turn it over to Karen to address. I think the one thing I did want to mention, because I know Commissioner Jordan mentioned it as you did, and I think the committee effort, the committee is quite a diverse group of stakeholders. It isn't just people that fly airplanes, it's people from the community, it's the FAA, it's a variety of different perspectives. And I think that's one thing that makes it very valuable, is not only to hear the perspectives of different stakeholders, but also the exchange that has taken part between the different committee members, because they sometimes come at it with a different view, and it's educational to the other committee members. So I think that's what's made it work very well.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Schwartz, I think it's important, what is important about the master plan is it plans the facilities into the future to accommodate the airlines when we can convince them to come to our community. As with the old terminal, it was very difficult because there were, space considerations that weren't being met for the airlines and flight delays and that sort of thing. So the best that we can do is make sure that we do take the long view and do provide the facilities so that when those opportunities come up, we can, get the airline in there quickly.
May I ask you as a follow-on, do we actually, or will we be marketing, more proactively marketing our airport facilities as we move through this process and bring all of our real estate online, so to speak, so that perhaps we could cultivate more interest from broader variety of carriers or have them just ramp up their own volume here?
Right.
Ms. Ramsdell?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Schwartz. We do that already. We have a quite active air service marketing program with the airlines, and we just don't brag about it very much because it's usually a long-term effort to convince an airline that we have the population here that's going to use, their flights, and they can make a profit. So we do that daily, and we have people on our staff that are dedicated to doing that. So yes, I guess the short answer is yes. But
Well, maybe that would be something that we could brag about more, so to speak, because I'm not sure a lot of members of the public know that it's a proactive, strategic and operational effort. And perhaps that would increase the appreciation for, our efforts, and that we're going to continue to push that envelope for the benefit of the public, the general aviation public. Thank you.
Commissioner Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a series of questions and some comments that I would like to pass on. If we could first maybe put up the slide that you had that was the aerial photo of the master plan with all the labeling, that one. I was curious why you're still showing the prior design of the terminal that was never built. Now that we have a new terminal, it's a totally different. I would think that you'd at least update that base photograph as you go to future outreach meetings and so forth.
If it's all right, I'll go
Mr.
ahead,
Harris?
Madam Chair, and address the Commissioner's comments as they come up. Excellent point. This particular photo does reflect the older terminal. I think it might have shown a little bit of construction activity taking place. However, you're right. We have had new photography and all new mapping done of the airport, which will all be integrated into the final plan. So actually, I think the next series of exhibits that we start to produce will have obtained all the new photography. Yeah.
And then can you clarify, you're talking about the 20-year planning effort, but in reading the attachment that was in our staff report, it said that the master plan was completed in March of 2003, so this is an update. Does it change that planning horizon, or is this just an intermediate milestone?
Well, generally, that was the completion date, Commissioner, of the last master, or the last facilities plan is what it was called at that time. But it's not unusual. The FAA and most airports will also take this position, as they like to update their plans about every 10 years. So you're kind of at that point. The last plan was completed in 2003, and I think most everything identified in that particular plan has been completed in terms of improvements. So really the next step after the completion of those is then to take a step back, refocus on the future. Where do we go from this point forward? So that was the initiation of the new master plan.
So this will be for the next 20-year looking forward period then?
Yes, sir.
Once you get it completed in a year or so?
We'll look, yes, sir, that's exactly correct. And although it'll be a 20-year look into the future, you may find, dependent upon how activity occurs, what happens with the economy, that plan may last longer than 10 years. It may be completed in 10 years if all things come to fruition. So you may update it in 10 years again.
Also, you had a slide that was showing the different lines of the capacity versus the usage. Can you explain why the capacity line is dropping over time?
Yes. Great question. Madam Chair, Commissioner Bartlett, what's referred to here is this line dropping. And what happens with capacity of an airfield? The airfield capacity changes as the fleet mix, meaning the different types of aircraft that operate at the airport. So you have, for example, a small Cessna 152 or a 172, very slow approach speed in comparison to a larger, higher performance corporate jet or a passenger jet. So as you have more of that mix, you have dissimilar performance characteristics of the aircraft. It basically slows things down. It's not unlike a highway where things are moving slower or faster and the capacity starts to drop. It doesn't drop substantially, and there are things that we will be doing. When I mentioned efficiencies in taxiway improvements, oftentimes just making some taxiway improvements will raise this capacity number. It allows the what we would call the runway occupancy time to diminish. You get the aircraft off the runway onto a taxiway system and out of the way, so your capacity numbers can come up.
Okay, and then a comment about the general aviation component. I like the direction that you're taking of trying to shift all that to the north of the main runway and then have all the public transportation component to the south. I think that's a good direction. And then you mentioned that in doing that, it will increase the demand for new hangar space and everything on the north side. And I guess I wanted to understand, since this is city property, how this factors in with our non-residential growth management. What categories will hangars and flight support services and so forth be coming out of, just so that we can understand how that comes out of our future buckets of growth.
Okay. Well, again, on the, I don't know if the photo might be the best.
Ms. Weiss, are you going to respond?
I can answer that in terms of the city's growth management program. That's actually a related item next on your agenda. The council direction with the update of the general plan was to set out $1.35 million in certain categories. And the discussion also included what type of development would not be included in the 1.35. And that is includes, I'm using the word include a lot, government buildings. So some of the airport functions probably will come under the heading of government buildings, and then some of the airport improvement, different facilities with the general aviation and the lessees and such, that would come out from the various categories we have in the 1.53 million. The airport has done a lot of tracking along with the planning division in terms of demolitions that have occurred, and they have quite a supply actually of demolition square footage that could be rebuilt, and that is what we would look to first. We also did a property inventory of existing parcels on the airport that meet the definition of vacant land and that they were legal parcels with no improvement. I think the year is like 1988 or something. So we're aware of the vacant land survey, which allows for a floor area ratio of 0.25. So the first places they would look to is the demolition square footage and vacant land, and then after that, minor and small additions. So there is, and we will align our record keeping and see how that will look to the future in terms of building development. I'm not aware that it will be a particular problem at this point, but we'll certainly be working with them to see how it does line up.
And then I would assume that a hangar structure would be treated just like a garage, where
correct. Parking.
You're storing a transportation vehicle, right?
That is correct. That's the determination we've made in the last 20 years. When a hangar, it's excluded from the definition of floor area because
Commercial
it's parking.
flight support is coming out then, right?
Right, if it's a warehouse and has office or a shop and things like that, yeah.
I just wanted to get a general sense of how, because there's a lot of parts, so.
And we've been doing this pretty successfully the last 20 years with the airport as well.
Okay, great. Well, that's it, and you're doing a good job.
Okay. Commissioner Campanella.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm a novice at this, and it's very informative to hear about. In going through your analysis of constraints, Jim, you mentioned hotel. I think you used the word. Is that similar where aircraft might have to temporarily park if a gate is not available? Is that what hotel means?
Oh, no. The hotel is a designation, and that's one of the, we're guilty of this quite often, is there's so many acronyms in this business and the nomenclature. Taxiway hotel is the designation of a specific taxiway. It's taxiway H. We often refer to it as hotel or golf or one of those. So it's, but you're absolutely correct. It gets very confusing, so I should be more clear.
Okay. And then you mentioned about 65% of capacity then, and back to the, not the term hotel, but penalty box, or if you go into certain airports and either you arrive early or late, gate might not be available.
Yeah.
At the 65% capacity, is there enough room available for temporarily arriving early and not having a gate for safety purposes, being out there for 10 or 15 minutes? There's enough room to manipulate that for commercial aircraft?
Generally there is. I haven't heard of really any incidents where it's been a particular problem, but again, that's one of the things we'll be looking at. We've got, well, there's one condition on the airplane. If you can go back to the photo, possibly. Things that we look at, just the airfield photo. There's an area, just for example, right here, there's a little taxiway comes off of the crosswind runway right into where the terminal area is. So we want to look at that a little bit and possibly eliminate that conflict, because if there are aircraft backing out of the gate, that does create a bit of a blockage. So if you have a taxiway coming right in there, it could be a conflict. So those are excellent points. We want to look at those and ensure that we don't have those occurring in the future as activity increases at the terminal. That's one of the reasons the overflow parking that I mentioned earlier. Right now, all of this area down in here is really dedicated toward general aviation activity, and if that area can be freed up and the ramp area expanded in certain areas, if an aircraft does come in and has to hold off to an apron, it will be out of the flow of traffic and will not cause any problems.
Okay, thank you. One more question, if I can. As far as your demographic and other analysis, as far as, I guess, two questions. One, the mix of aircraft that you anticipate in the future, is that tied into, let's say, fuel efficiency that the airlines might be looking at in certain types of aircraft as you would see demand in the future? And then part B of that is, did you also look, let's say, regionally at Santa Maria and Oxnard, what their future plans are, and does that affect your demand model here as well?
The answer to both questions is, Madam Chair, Commissioner Campanella, is yes, we did look at both. The fleet mix that we look at for the airlines, we go so far as to actually look at the advance orders of the aircraft that they're purchasing or have on order, so that we have a good sense of what aircraft each airline is transitioning to. Also, we have projections from all of the manufacturers of what their projection orders are, so we kind of know the timing of a lot of those. We do look at the other airports. We look at the basing and their service areas. Each airport has its own semi-unique service area for servicing base aircraft. Now, they can overlap service areas depending upon facilities you provide that they don't, or they provide that you don't. So we look at that to make sure that you're serving the broadest amount of the service areas you can, particularly for your local citizens. So.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Campanella. Mr. Berman, in your introductory remarks, this isn't directly related to the master plan, you said the terminal will be complete in a couple of weeks. Does that mean the old terminal, all the work on refurbishing it and all the paving, and is this short-term parking lot operational and so on? Could you tell us what's happening with that?
Madam Chair, that's correct. The seemingly endless construction project is fastly coming to completion. The historic terminal is all but open. It's we've got the flooring and the paint is all in. It's just a matter of exterior landscaping. The short-term lot will be in a week or 2 weeks, and things will start not returning to normal, but finally reaching the sort of vision.
Okay, great. Mrs. Ramsdell, my recollection is that the peak employment number was a lot higher than what we're experiencing now. And what was that number?
I think it was in the, what year? Your highest? 89, 90. We had like 880-some thousand passengers. So if you divide that in half, you get approximately what our employments were at that time. And through all the changes in economy and the airline industry, we've lost some ground. So we'll be building that back up over the next 20 years.
Well, it's good to know that there seems to be plenty of capacity for whatever may happen in the future in terms of growth. You said, Mr. Harris, that you'd be going on to alternatives. I don't have an image of what alternatives would be.
Yes, Madam Chair, the alternatives evaluation is we will literally take each area of the airport, whether it's the airfield, whether it's the terminal area, or whether it's that north side development. We'll take a look at each area separately and start to come up with various concepts for how that could be developed, how you can grow that area, how you could, we talked about the north side, for example. There's a variety of different ways you can reconfigure some of the taxiways and hangar development over in that area. We'll look at areas that might be new development of hangars, and was mentioned earlier, we'll also be looking at redevelopment of areas. So we'll come up with several different options with the idea that it's a really good way to generate a good discussion amongst the committee members and get thoughts and ideas. And quite frankly, when we go through an alternatives process, that's our objective, is to generate those thoughts and ideas. And I can tell you without a doubt, at the end of the day, you don't pick one alternative or another. You start picking the best part of this one and the best part of this one, and you then kind of formulate, and it comes into focus much better what the best plan is for the airport. So there'll be a series of different options, if you will.
Okay, good. Thank you. Commissioner Bartlett.
Yes, I had one last question for Mr. Harris. What would be the land use implications beyond the airport as you consider the runway protection zones, out from those different runways? I mean, are you acquiring land or demolishing buildings or restricting use? What would we expect to see on that analysis?
I think the only area that we were talking about originally, on that one slide I mentioned the runway protection zone, and I believe it's generally right up in this little corner, and that's the building that was, is that the one that was recently torn down? Yeah, right, this one here?
Right,
Yeah.
that one.
So some of these little areas are something that you oftentimes should look at ensuring that nothing further is built, or we see from time to time we'll see someone put an antenna on a building who wish they hadn't. So sometimes it's just securing an easement so they don't do something that would be negative to the flight of aircraft. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other comments, questions from the planning commissioners? Well, it looks as if very good progress is being made, and congratulations. And I'm so glad to hear the terminal project is almost really finally done. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes our discussion of the airport master plan, and we go on next. Item 4 is a public hearing, a recommendation to City Council on a proposed zoning ordinance amendment on the development plan review and approval. Ms. Weiss.
Thank you, Chair Lodge and Planning Commissioners. Today we're holding a public hearing for the Planning Commission to consider forwarding a recommendation to the City Council regarding a proposed zoning ordinance amendment. The zoning ordinance amendment before you today is the development plan ordinance, and it pertains to the city's growth management program. I'm going to go over some background that you are all very familiar with. In 1989, there was an election for a charter amendment which established a growth management program, often referred to as Measure E, and that established a 20-year plan for the city. At that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, we were going through a general plan update as well. So the general plan amendments were approved by the City Council in 1990 and then implemented in various city programs and ordinances. So the ordinance, Santa Barbara Municipal Code Section 2887-300, is the development plan and approval ordinance, and that is the one that deals primarily with non-residential growth in the city. You're also quite aware that for the last several years, we've been updating the general plan again and have had extensive discussions about what would take the place with the sunsetting of the Measure E Charter Section 20 years, that plan, what would take its place. And that was one of the primary reasons for doing the general plan update. The conclusion of the general plan was to establish a new maximum capacity for build-out in non-residential areas in the city, and that process, while we were going through it, we were seeing the sunset of the charter and the ordinance needing to be extended while we completed the general plan. So we came to the Planning Commission and City Council with recommendations to extend the development plan ordinance. And the ordinance was extended to January of next year, 2013. At the time, the Planning Commission and City Council were considering that extension. I know for the Commission in particular, you really wanted to keep the time period short so that would be, the idea was that would be motivation to complete the general plan update and move forward. What we didn't know was that actually the City Council was going to create an ad hoc advisory committee and have an additional 2 years of deliberations on the general plan. So the 3-year time extension, which is now going to expire in 2013, really was not enough time. As you're aware, the general plan was adopted by the City Council in 2011. So this year, January, we're right back to work on implementing the general plan. We held a work session with the Planning Commission and City Council and said that updating this ordinance is one of our top priorities, and we have been on it all this time. We did come to the Planning Commission in May with an initiation meeting where we had worked out quite a bit of the details related to an update of this ordinance, and you provided us good input on subjects such as economic development, pacing the small additions, and so forth. And then also since May and June, we held our first discussion with the Planning Commission on the transportation or traffic components. And as you're aware, that subject is quite substantial. We also had 2 stakeholder group meetings in the last several months, and then earlier this month on September 6th, we held a special work session to talk through and get a better handle on traffic. So with all that work going on, as well as drafting an ordinance with review ultimately by the City Council, including leading up to that, again, a hearing with the Planning Commission, the Ordinance Committee, it's just not possible to complete that work this calendar year. So we are here asking for a 1-year extension on the existing ordinance, and that our work on the zoning amendments for the new general plan, we expect to be completed early next year. So I'll just go through that a little bit more detail. The recommendation is attached to your staff report is the draft ordinance amendment, where you can see simply the only change being made really is to change the date from January 1st, 2013 to January 1st, 2014. There is a technical fix that we are recommending similar to what we did with the last extension, which is to refresh the small addition category with 30,000 square feet for 2013. I will explain that, but I'm certainly open to questions if this explanation doesn't make sense to you. But initially, when the charter section and the general plan and ordinance were put in place, this category called small addition has 600,000 square feet. And basically, that's 30,000 square feet per year for 20 years. Because the 20-year period has now lapsed, the ordinance doesn't really read properly without taking an action in terms of all of our square footage accounting. So whenever small addition projects were not applied for in any given year and there was some of the 30,000 left over, it went into a category called economic development. And so now we are looking to go back to that category of economic development and take out 30,000 for this next calendar year, the year 2013. Everything else is proposed to remain the same in terms of processing applications. We have, like I said, we're in process right now on amending the program, and the direction really is to continue a per parcel allocation of development potential. So it's quite seamless in many respects to just continue the current operation and practice with the development plan ordinance. I will state, though, that I think there's one area of exception or a little bit of a rub, and it is this transportation area. You know, because we are under the current ordinance, we have the finding of no significant traffic impacts, and yet we're having a really in-depth discussion with you all in the community about, well, how are we going to change that? What staff is proposing, and we have done with the few projects that we're seeing right now, we really aren't even seeing that many projects, so it's a good time to be in this uncomfortable switching position. But what we are doing with the current projects is following our current standard practice of still doing a traffic analysis and looking at cumulative projects and looking at site-specific conditions and seeing, you know, how much traffic we think the new project would generate, and having projects only move forward if we think that we can make the finding of no significant traffic impact. Our proposal is that once the new ordinance is in effect, at that time, we will have an accounting of, like we always do, of which projects are pending, haven't been acted on, and how will the new standards apply to any project that hasn't yet been approved. So that'll be a discussion with you shortly as we move forward. But for now, in this ordinance, we're not proposing any changes to the process or findings. So this ordinance, which is the extension of time of 1 year, our next step, presuming that we receive a favorable recommendation from you all today, will be to move to the ordinance committee meeting of October 23rd, and then to a council introduction hearing for the ordinance on November 13th, and then a council adoption hearing on November 20th. City council ordinances take 30 days to become fully effective, so that'll bring us just to the end of the year and have the new ordinance in place before the current one expires. Also attached to your staff report is a companion resolution. Again, to just comment briefly, we are in the process of updating that resolution as well so that it makes sense with the whole new program that we've been talking about. But again, for today's purposes, we've only, we've been working with the city attorney, and he's drafted just enough amendments to the current resolution to make it possible to carry forward again same practice for 1 more year. So you also see in the resolution some recommended amendments in your staff report. So that concludes our report, and we are here for questions. And thank you.
Any questions? Mr. Campanella.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Weiss, when the GMO does come into effect, the new $1,350,000 and the categories that are applied thereto will all come into effect. So we'll be moving forward with new ordinance for the GMO. Is that correct?
Yes.
So effectively what we're doing is if the current small additions, and I guess if we're running out of the ability to give somebody square footage in the interim, this is sort of replenishing it. So as the economy improves a little bit, let's say over the time allowed this year, that people can become active rather than constrained waiting for the new ordinance. Is that a benefit of what we'd be accomplishing?
Yes, that is the effect of what we'd be accomplishing. And again, we explained this a couple years ago, and I want to restate it now. This extension does not involve increasing the overall 3 million square feet of the original program. It's just reallocating back so that applicants can make proposals. Yes.
Okay. And then when we move forward under GMO, if I recall, some of the suggestions that we had come up with when we reviewed it here was that under the new 400,000 square feet, which would be 20,000 a year over a 20-year period, we'd evaluate at the end of the year for some type of rollover or things like that. So this, I think, with 30,000 being regenerated, I think in comparison to what we're looking at going forward, I think it's probably pretty comparable to make sure that people aren't too constrained if they want to improve their property. So if I have the correct assumption, I'm pretty pleased with being able to participate in doing that.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Councilmember Campanella. Yes, we had that same discussion that we figured once this allocation of 30,000 square feet was made, we would just carry that over into the first year of the new growth management ordinance, because not that I expect this, but you know, in the event that 30,000 square feet of applications came in between now and March, because I'm hoping it's March that we have the new program, and that I'm not here again asking for any more time. But anyway, once this decision's made, it does create a certain expectation that 30,000 square feet is available for this calendar year. So that was staff's intention.
Good. Thank you.
Commissioner Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Ms. Weiss. So if we look back, Measure E had our limit at 3 million square feet over a 20-year allocation. With the 3-year extension and now this proposed 1-year extension, we've really stretched the time frame out to 24 years, but with the same allocation limit of 3 million square feet. So on the next 20-year component, are we now looking at the 1.35 million square feet being compressed into the remaining 16 years, or is it a rolling 20-year into the future? I'm just trying to understand how it's going to get metered out going forward.
Ms. Weiss?
Well, a couple of things. One is I am also looking forward to the final accounting of Measure E and seeing where, after with these extensions and everything, what out of the 3 million actually got allocated and built. And I think that'll be an important adaptive management program report when we get to that, to reporting with you on this. What we established as a procedure for review of the growth management program in the last 20 years, and again, it's an adaptive management component, is typically annual reports to the Planning Commission. And I recall we did a substantial report after 5 years in, and then after 10 years in. And there was a statement, I don't know exactly where it occurs, I think it's probably in the council resolution or somewhere, that said at least 5 years prior to the expiration of the plan, we would begin the process again. So it's hard for me to predict or give you a accurate answer to your question, because I think it kind of depends. But the intention is that this is a 20-year plan starting January 1st, 2012, really, because that's when the council adopted the general plan in 2011, December 2011. But, these aren't hard and fast dates. We will start working on an update of the general plan probably at least 5 years, before. And we're going to be doing the adaptive management program and some really big components of the general plan, such as the average unit density program has an 8-year horizon. So, we don't have every year mapped out just yet.
Okay, so the theory is then the 1.35 million would carry out 20 years from the January 2012 date?
Right, okay. Yes. That is the effectiveness of the ordinance, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
And Ms. Weiss, as I recall, although it was 3 million in the charter amendment that was voted on by the public, all that was used was more like 1 million square feet, and that was where we came up, in the planning process, came up with the 1.35 million for the next 20-year increment. Do I remember correctly?
I think staff has been saying that we used about 1.5 million. And again, we will certainly share with you that final accounting once we're done, including with this extension. But I think we were saying it was about 1.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you reference the 2.5 years back to January 2010 for the small addition usage, and it's been like 7,000 a year, right? Just 20,000 used. So as a history lesson, which you would be in a better position than me. So if you go back 15 or 20 years, was that 30,000 a year ever a real cap? Did that come into play?
Yes, we had a few years, quite a bit of excitement. Maybe you didn't hear about it, but we had people lined up outside of the office at 630 Garden Street to come in on the first working day in January to have their small addition allocation. And we did a lot of, and there were, I think, I can remember approximately 3 years of where it was pretty tight, and we would run out of small addition allocation.
How long ago was the last time that happened, do you think?
Like 95? I think it was about 95, 96,
okay.
Yeah.
So, and then, so we'd have to go a long way back economically, or maybe we're just too built out now or whatever. But if we were in the situation where you ran up against that in 1 year and you'd allowed unused allocations to leak out the prior year, as we're doing every year now, is there a process where that can come back in?
Well, when we were here with the Planning Commission in May, that was a topic of interest that, again, we're working with Mr. Vincent in the City Attorney's Office on this resolution. We think at the end of each year, we're going to have the Planning Commission decide should they roll over the small addition into next year and kind of just carry it forward like a health savings account, or would it go into the pot of community benefit? If we follow the same model that we have in this current ordinance, unused square footage from small addition goes into economic development. It would be unused small addition goes into community benefit. But the commission thought that we should have you look at that remaining square footage and decide if you want to roll it over into the next year or not.
It joggles my memory a little bit.
Right.
I'm remembering that.
Right.
Kind of on the same note, the subject of the traffic analysis, you're going to leave standing pat. Is there anything else in this kind of realm that would play a role like that too, that's changing significantly once you start adopting ordinances? Because I know one of the conversations we had here before was kind of turning a generous eye to something that's going to happen with ordinance adoptions that may not be in place now, whether somebody came forward with a modification or something that would comply with where we're going soon, but we're not quite there yet. Are there any other areas other than traffic analysis that would reach into that zone? And is it appropriate to suggest those as part of the ordinance, or just kind of keep that in your back pocket kind of thing?
I think that really we can continue to operate under the current ordinance for this extended period pretty easily without having to make any stretches or such. We are proposing, with your direction, and we'll see what council does, a very similar ordinance going forward in many respects, but then there's some important differences as well. The only area that is a particular difference is this program we've been talking about transferring of square footage. Again, we don't have a lot of pending TEDR projects right now that we're aware of. There may be people thinking about TEDRs because it is somewhat of it is a private market exchange. The square footage is not brokered by the city. It's a deal between private property owners. So, so there's changes in terms of the TEDR, and there's changes in terms of traffic. But unlike the modification approach, there really isn't an outlet such as a modification in this particular ordinance. But again, I really believe this needs to be a short-term extension. We would plan to be back to you with the proposed new program for a hearing and recommendation before the end of this year, and then be right after the holidays before Council's Ordinance Committee and the Council itself to adopt the new program. Okay. We don't want this edge zone to continue, although I don't see it having any conflict where, if I did, I probably could point to where it would be in the ordinance and we would have asked you to make the change.
Okay.
So I think we're okay.
Good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? This is a public hearing. I'm not seeing anyone in the council chambers aside from staff and the commission.
We did extensive notice for this, by the way.
Pardon me?
Madam Chair, I just want to note that we did fairly extensive notice for this hearing.
Okay.
But again, with the level of development activity, and if anyone is looking towards this as a fairly simple, straightforward project, we didn't receive any questions or anything from the public.
May I? Planning Commission, Commissioner Larson.
I just, when I read all this, I thought, well, isn't this, and thought about Measure E and how we've used it. I thought this is kind of the progenitor of adaptive management that we'll be looking at as we go forward. So I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective looking back. Thanks.
Okay, well, a motion would be in order on this item, this recommendation. Commissioner Bartlett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm prepared to make a motion to forward the proposed amendment to Section 2887-300 and Council Resolution 09058 to the City Council for future adoption.
Second?
To extend the timeline to January 1st, 2014.
Second that motion?
Motion made to concur with the staff recommendation, seconded by Commissioner Schwartz.
Madam Chair, under discussion?
Yes.
Do we need to add that there's that we're rescinding Resolution 99-03609? Oh, wait, went too far. It would be 99-036, I think. Is that right? It's on page, second to last page. Do we need to include that?
Chair Lodge and
Please.
Commissioner Larson, that's the council resolution, and when they approve the updated one, that will happen automatically.
Okay,
Thank you.
All right, any other comments, questions on the motion? Then all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Unanimously passed. That brings us to item 5, administrative agenda, committee and liaison reports. First is the staff hearing officer liaison report. Commissioner Larson?
Well, it's there was a noticing problem. So we were all excited because we had 5 applications, and they got postponed to the 3rd. So added to the 3, that makes a very full meeting of 8 for October 3rd. So that's the report for the show. The HLC, there was an interesting discussion about changes to the entry sequence of the Lobero, not the building itself, but the landscape, the hardscape, and the surround, and it had to do with the original intent of the architect. So we may, if I understand correctly, we'll be seeing some stairs instead of that continuous ramping condition. Also, on the agenda of interest was in addition to changes at the Santa Barbara Inn, landscaping upgrades. So those were on as well. And the continuation of 2300 Garden Street's pursuit of landmarking status. So those were the key components. Thank you.
Commissioner Campanella?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I attended a housing forum that was put on and organized and facilitated by John Ledbetter, and Betty Weiss was there providing a lot of technical support. This was held on September 12th, and it was interesting in that present were practitioners relative to employer housing, and that included Ron Biscaro of Cottage, Michael Tobes, Rochelle Rose, Craig Zimmerman of the Tobes Group, and also Ed Soto, B of A Mortgage, who's providing financing for the program. And I thought it was very well attended, and perhaps I can ask Ms. Weiss some of the takeaways, I think, that came out of that meeting and some other items you might want to discuss.
Ms. Weiss?
Yes, thank you. The panel discussion was moderated by Steve Americaner, and they had a little bit of time preparing as a group that he would pose key questions such as what forms the basis for the need for an employer housing program? What would be the interest and why is this important? Other questions such as what are the challenges in terms of the community providing workforce housing or a employer looking to do a workforce housing type of project, and what ideas do people have that could make a workforce housing program successful, among other general questions such as that. So the dialogue was really interesting. Mr. Biscaro, shared his experience in terms of the Cottage Hospital program, which is quite extensive and large, but many of the people in the group seem familiar as well with either the Westmont program or UCSB's program, and a very well-informed group of people. And so the really challenging thing was to think, well, beyond larger employers in the community, how might the city's program be shaped to help smaller employers or groups of employers? So you all have heard from Deddy Pikert, his idea of a consortium of or group of employers, and he participated on the panel and shared his ideas as well. We also had David Rao from the city's housing staff on the panel, and as John Campanella mentioned, Ed Soto, and they talked quite a bit about the covenants and the forms and just creating as much of a template and a way forward for people. And then I also added a few comments in terms of, looking to the charrette experiences that the AIA provided, as not a full prototype, but again, at least a visualization of the type of projects that might be possible. We could also look to other model projects in the community, whether or not they were employer housing or not. And then I also commented on environmental review because we have a program EIR with the Plan Santa Barbara project and this whole growth management thing we're talking about in terms of encouraging housing. We think that the process can be made more simply. And of course, time is money and land is money. Those were certainly highlighted as, particular challenges for any project, but also in Santa Barbara. So the forum was taped by our Channel 18 and is available for viewing on the Channel 18 site. And we can send you all a link to that site, or for the general public, just go on citytv18.com. And I just gave the instructions to John. What did I say? You push videos on demand and then special programs.
Right.
And that's where you can view the forum. I think we're also going to attach to that video, we haven't done it yet, a summary, like a written document that also summarizes the highlights of the discussion.
Madam Chair, I think that'd be good. The summary, I think both, if people are really interested, both would be welcome. One, the summary is really a how-to on the considerations from people that have to work with it every day and trying to look forward to implementation. So I think having that outline is really good for step-by-step process. And I think the other important thing on the tape is it wasn't that long, but there was great interchange. I thought it was a real good group where they came up with creative thoughts just by talking it out. So I'd recommend looking at both if you're interested in the subject and the public as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Campanella. Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of weeks ago, you guys were all toiling away here. I was at the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, and it's just an item of note that applied to Santa Barbara is they adopted a resolution that further structured the development and control of post-construction stormwater runoff. When Phase 1, which are municipalities over 100,000 people, and Phase 2, which are under 100,000 people, went through their NPDES permit. Ours was about 5 or 6 years ago, and developed their stormwater management programs. They were left to develop what they thought would qualify and submit it to the state or the regional water board. And the plan at that time was to come back in the future either with their renewal or with other adoption of regulation to further strengthen up specifically requirements on runoff related to volume and velocity, and in particular using low impact development. And a couple of reasons that it was just very apropos to Santa Barbara was that when Santa Barbara adopted theirs 5 or 6 years ago, we were very aggressive in our stormwater management plan in terms of runoff and in availability of techniques and toolboxes, toolkits for low impact development. Anything as simple as the curb cutout you see leading to a detention pond down at the base of Cliff Drive in Las Positas, to the giant project at the golf course or the parking lot project at McKenzie Park. And all of those have been a result of our aggressive push on using low-impact development to handle stormwater management. Many other cities didn't go that far. And the outreach and resource building that the Regional Water Board has done over the past 3 years has included taking Santa Barbara's documentation and toolbox and literally just handing it to other municipalities and saying, here, if you're looking for the way to start one, just take this and use it. So that was kind of gratifying. And then it came up during the course of the publicity for that and the agenda that the requirements on the resolution at the Water Board for the Regional Water Board were going to actually add some burdens on reporting and record keeping on the City of Santa Barbara. So a program that far exceeded the new requirements that were being placed by the Regional Water Board was also going to have to incur more expense in reporting and guidelines just to come in compliance from a procedural point of view. And Cameron Benson successfully, before the hearing, was able to add have the staff add a revision into the adopted resolution that allowed the executive officer at the regional level to make an exception for any program that already exceeded the new requirements of the program. Jeff Young is on that board with me also, and we would sit in the corner and kind of call that the Santa Barbara clause. So, and we were the only municipality that we anticipate will be able to enjoy that at this time. So it was very gratifying to see that we were out in front of that. I am frequently leery of procedures and policies being crammed down on top of developers and stifling them or causing extra expense. But this is clearly one where we were out in front and in the forefront of what was coming at the state level also. So I'm happy to report that.
Thank you, Commissioner Jordan. Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Last week I attended the Downtown Parking Committee meeting, and the Victoria Theater renovation project, with the applicant being Ensemble Theater, was a main highlight, I would say, of the committee's time. I'll just call out several issues that are still under discussion and negotiation between the applicant and the city, and the Downtown Parking Committee is still wrestling over these. One is the two parking loading cutout area in front of the theater, and the question of sufficient loading space with anticipated queuing out into the street. So, to be resolved in the future. And then this applicant and the city, are specifically transportation, are looking at a possible reconfiguration of sorts or reuse, alteration of use of what's currently an entrance off of Victoria into that public parking lot. There's now talk of it possibly being an exit only, or specially managed for special events, just like the Granada entrances. So there would be sort of special coordination when Victoria Theater is having plays there. But that, again, is to be determined, and of course safety is a big issue that's being discussed both for the auto traffic and pedestrians who are using that area. And lastly, while the theater is under renovation and major construction activity will be taking place, the question is where all of those construction vehicles will park and at whose expense. So that too is being discussed and negotiated. And part of this, I think, longer term plan is discussion with Park and Rec about whether or not there could be greater utilization of the Louise Lowry Davis parking lot across the street, because currently it's highly underutilized, but it doesn't have lighting. So for nighttime parking, it's not safe, it's not easy, and so that too is underway. So much still to be worked out, but the project is going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. And Commissioner Larson.
One last thing. I attended the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors meeting for the presentation by the Governor's Office of Volunteer Services of an award to our Community Emergency Response Team organization here. That would include UCSB County, of Santa Barbara, City of Santa Barbara. So there were a lot of people there from the Office of Emergency Services. And it's for the tremendous amount of work that's being done to create volunteer cadre to help us be a disaster-resistant community. So you'll see more about what we call CERT in upcoming. This is Disaster Preparedness Month, so that's why this is all out and about. But it was quite a nice thing and a great accomplishment for our county. So we can be proud, but we're not ready yet. So for only 20 hours of your time invested, you too can learn how to wear that hard hat and have a vest that glows. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Larson. The Water Commission, this last meeting, it was a lengthy agenda, but a couple of the highlights were, some of you will remember our visit to the Cater treatment plant with the expansion that had to be made because of the having to treat water highly polluted with ash as a result of the Zaka fire, which burned 2/3 of the watershed for Gibraltar. And when we were there, the hydroelectric plant, which has just been sitting there because of federal regulations, but staff was pointed out, and staff has been working on for years, getting it under city control. And a big step was made. The feds declared it excess property, and so now it can be transferred. So they're working on that, which will be great to have our own, at least some hydroelectric power. In connection with that Cater, the Advanced Treatment Project, they have filtration tanks that were ordered, so these were part of the project. Some years ago, they were replaced, and when they went out to bid, they had certain specifications. They had to take the lowest bid, or what was equal in quality, presumably. Well, it turns out that it wasn't equal in quality, and the lining is deteriorating on the tanks far sooner than was expected. So it's just another one of the expenditures for the water department. Okay, so there are no other reports from anyone? That will conclude our Planning Commission meeting for today, and it is adjourned.